Okay, we're back to the standard agreement of sale for Pennsylvania. Part two, we're picking up right after number 9 there. We're starting at number 10 here. And at number 10, they give you some options of what to check regarding this property. If you're double thinking yourself and saying, boy, I went to that property, I never thought to ask if it was on a well or if it was a septic system, then certainly go back into the MLS and see what the public records say. If it's a regular property with tap water and it comes from the street, it's public water, you just pretty much collect that. If it's on-site water with a well, you would check well. And then down here, you would move on to public sewer if it's a typical property that's tied into public sewers. Now, it gets a little bit complicated after that. If you have a septic system, um, you have a bunch of different choices. You might notice there's a 10-acre permit exception, individual online septic disposal, holding tank, individual online sewer system, which also has a well in proximity to a well. That would be an exception. If there's a well and a septic system on the same property, they have to be a certain amount of space away from each other, and it's something that well and septic inspectors check. We always want to have a septic inspection unless it's a brand new system. We always want to have the water tested for bacteria at the very minimum. But here's a little PhD level on that. If you have an FHA, or actually if you have any kind of a transaction now, all the underwriters are pretty much the same. I suggest you have two different tests, one with a very small panel, bacteria, iron, a couple other important things to make sure the water is potable or safe to drink. And then the water companies are going to give you an opportunity for like a 200 panel test, which will tell you everything, magnesium, zinc, all these different things you're probably not worried about. The odds of one of those 200 things being off a little bit is pretty good. I would say half the time something is. But if you put that in front of a mortgage company underwriter, they're going to have a problem with it, and they're going to say, we need a $10,000 system to get the magnesium out of the water, or whatever the deal is, something that you don't care about, and it certainly junks up the sale and makes it difficult to proceed. So the idea is most buyers, I suggest, they get a short panel for their own purposes and something going to show the lender if they have to. And if they're interested in that long panel, get that on the side. Let them digest that separate from the mortgage company. Just because mortgage companies don't understand or really don't care to understand all the nuances of what's in a typical water report. Along the same lines, you never really want to give a home inspection report to a mortgage company unless they specifically ask for it. They can't understand anything that could possibly be wrong with the house. They have to deny the loan if they happen to see anything at all that's wrong with the property. So if you have any unusual situations in here, anything other than number one, individual on-lot sewage disposal system, hey, give me a call. We'll talk about it. Let's kind of stay out of trouble. There's a whole bunch of notices you might want to read here. Explaining what those, actually you do want to read those and be expert in it, but read those when you get a chance and you'll have a little bit of an idea of what's going on. And a couple things to understand about uh, public sewer, private sewer systems in Pennsylvania is that if there's a cesspool present, which is basically like a well, a big stone well underneath the ground, if that cesspool is failing, you can't replace it with another cesspool. And then you have, and there's a reason they put a cesspool in and not a septic system in the very beginning. There was some percolation problems or the ground wouldn't absorb water. So if there's a cesspool, a little red flag should pop up and you should start thinking, wow, if the cesspool doesn't pass, then you're involved in a whole different type of system, maybe a sand mound system, which is an above ground kind of a not so attractive system, or all kinds of other options. So if you see a cesspool, give me a call. We'll talk about what that means with your sale and what your buyer should know about a cesspool. A lot of properties out in the country here, I'm down to land use restrictions and historic preservation. If it's historically preserved, you should put in here that everybody's aware of it. That will limit the buyer's ability to make some repairs or make some changes in the property. And then these Act 43, Act 319, all these different open space and conservation laws. So what does that mean? Someone owns 35 acres in Chester County. They don't want to pay taxes on the value of the property as if it could be developed someday. So they commit to agricultural or horse use for the property. They get their taxes lowered, and supposedly they're never supposed to be to change it back to the other uses, and then it will be counted in the green space that's available for the state. So obviously that's something a buyer would want to know about. They might buy the property thinking they could develop a lot out of it, but if it has one of these acts, one of these one of these notices in it, then that's something everyone should be aware of. So if you see anything like that, review the seller disclosure. If it usually would be in the MLS language, hey, this ground is protected under Act 43 or something along those lines. Then we're going to move our way down here. We've got the real estate seller disclosure law. That will go on to tell you that if it's less than 1 to 4 units, basically the seller must comply with the real estate seller disclosure law. And in every sale, you should be looking for the seller disclosure. Make sure it's complete, make sure it jives with your understanding of the property, and then give it to the buyer to review before they sign the agreement of sale. I'll say that again. Give it to the buyer to review before they sign the agreement of sale, if at all possible. So we have public or private assessments. If there's an unusual assessment on the property, something that, let's take a look at this. Seller represents as of the dates of the agreement of sale, no public improvement, condominium, or homeowner assessments have been made against the property, which remain unpaid. So if someone was in a condominium and say there was a ton of snow last year and they had a special assessment to pay for all the snow removal, you wouldn't find that in the public records. You'd have to find that here, so you would want to know about it. If there's any violations of the assessments, any fights, any arguments going on in the condominium or even in a private property, this is where you would put that in there. Highway occupancy permit here. Access to a public road may require issuance of a highway permit. That's just a notice. So let me give you an example. Someone lives right next to I-95. They buy the property and they think, wow, they're going to put a little driveway up to I-95 so they can get on and off of I-95 without having to go to the on-ramps and off-ramps like everybody else. Not the case. They have to get access to a public highway with the permission of the municipalities, and there won't be any private roads going to I-95. Basically, waiver of contingencies. In this agreement is contingent on the buyer's right to inspect the property, to verify all these different things, certification, zoning, blah, blah, blah. Buyer's failure to exercise buyer's options is a waiver of contingency. In other words, use it or lose it. If you choose not to have an inspection, not to do your due diligence, Mr. Buyer, then you're going to lose the ability to do that. And that may not stand up in law, but they're saying right here that, hey, buyers, have an inspection if you can. Now we get into the whole home inspection part, number 12 here. So basically this is important right here. Seller will provide access to the property. Buyer will make a pre-settlement walkthrough. This is new here. Seller will have the heating and all utilities, including fuel, on for all inspections or appraisals. All inspectors, including home inspectors, are authorized by buyer to provide a copy of the inspection report to broker for buyer. Seller has the right upon request to receive a free copy of the inspection report from the party for whom it was prepared. So there are all the new aspects of it after years of fighting about who can get a copy, who can see it, all that kind of stuff. We've come up with that, and we've nailed down that seller will have the heat and the utilities, obviously the electric and water, on for all inspections and appraisers. So if a seller doesn't make that available for the mortgage company, the buyer's off the hook as far as if a mortgage company has trouble appraising the property because everything wasn't on. So the way that this works is on the left-hand side, you would initial it if you want to have a general home inspection. On the right-hand side, you would initial if you want to waive it. So it's going to go into here, everything that could possibly be inspected in a normal home inspection. So most people initial that one. Wood infestation, same kind of thing. Termites, we talked about this in our termite training. Termites, carpenter bees, wood destroying, ants, beetles, all kinds of things. So always elect that. I wouldn't rely on any report. I'd get a new inspection for myself because in this area, the time of the year, things could change. You could have evidence of something going on. I wouldn't suggest waiving that. Deeds, restriction, and zoning. Buyer may investigate easements, deed, and restrictions, blah, blah, blah. So in a situation where someone wants to maybe add in-law quarters, have a home business, has a question about the seller's present use of the property, then I would elect this. Otherwise, I would just waive it because the normal inspections by you, the buyer broker, and the home, and the if there's a mortgage, the appraisal will kind of double check for all this stuff that everything's working with the local zoning ordinance. Along the same lines, because most townships have a use and occupancy inspection where people go in to make sure that everything is done according to the code, everything that was fixed had a permit, and that the present use is a legal use. Water service. If there's on-site water, the buyer can get a water test by initialing here and waiving there. Radon. So radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States, possibly the world. I'll say that again. Radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer. So I always recommend people get a radon test. They can choose to rely, save some money, save $125, and rely on the seller's disclosure, which may have said, hey, we just had one a year ago, everything was fine. Or you can choose to double check that if you want. It's a very personal thing. Elect it here, waive it there. On-lot sewage. So this will give you an opportunity if you have a septic, cesspool, or a sand mound system, and your property is not connected to public sewer, I'm sorry, to have that inspected. The cost for that are about $500. If the property hasn't been lived in for a while, they might want to do a load pressure test. Well, basically a hydraulic load test, which means they'll run water through the system for 3 whole days just to make sure everything works. They can't tell if it hasn't been used regularly by people living in the property. I really don't recommend waiving this if there's an on-site system. I would get it checked every time. Property and flood insurance. The appraiser is going to check to see if it's in a flood insurance. The buyer should be concerned about this. There are some properties that, for reasons inherent in the property or inherent in the owners of the property, where they're going to have difficulty getting homeowners insurance, maybe a lot of thefts. They might have a lot of issues going on with that property. The insurance companies keep really good records and they keep track of everything that goes on with the property. So if you elect here, you have an opportunity to go and call your homeowner's insurance person, not to get a rate quote, but just to make sure that the property is insurable. They'll go into their systems, their computer systems. They'll check the property, and if anything unusual is going on, you'll know about it. It's not really terribly important to worry about that, because if the property is uninsurable and it's discovered later, the lender's not going to insure the property, and lender's not going to put a mortgage on the property, and the buyer will get his money back. But again, it's something always to kind of be aware of. If you have a cash deal, you want to elect this every time just to make sure that it is an insurable property. You won't have that lender protection behind the scenes. Property boundaries. So in some places, if we get out into the country, there's some old, maybe 1 or 2 surveys on the property that may be suspect based on when it was done. In most of the residential Philadelphia market, we're going to rely on the survey that's on record, and the title company will guarantee that, so you don't have to go out and revisit getting a brand new survey. New construction, you'd want to do that. Building a new house, maybe next to a creek if there's a water boundary, as they can move. But to take that, every property is different. So for a regular row house or a house, a cookie cutter house in a suburban neighborhood, you don't have to worry about that. You would waive it. If it's an unusual situation, you'd elect it. Any questions, give me a call. Lead-based paint. I've got a kind of catch-22 here. So you don't want to be seen as the agent who waived a lead-based paint inspection and then find out later that there's lead-based paint in the property. However, you also know that almost all the older properties around here that we sell have lead-based paint in it. I suggest you elect it and let the buyer exercise it or not exercise an inspection. They can basically agree to spend $500 to see if there's lead in the house where they know that there's lead in the house, and it's their choice. But you don't want to be caught as a person who suggested that if you waived and you know that it's there. So you also want to deliver, of course, a lead-based paint pamphlet with all transactions, and of course an EPA pamphlet on mold and radon. So lead-based paint, mold, and radon. Best way to do it is go to the EPA websites, create a link to those 3 sites, and send it to your buyers, and you'll have proof that you've done it. Exterior building materials may result in moisture penetration. This is the beginning of talking about mold. Mold is something that we don't want to bring up. It's not good for sales, probably, best way to say it. But everyone should be aware that you can inspect for the things that can cause mold. There's some stucco treatments that are new, and some wood and drywall products that can contribute to mold in a property. And again, they're going to go on here. That was number 1. Number 2, asbestos. We'll tell buyers asbestos is an issue. Other environmental hazards, wetlands, mold, and basically just a quick little summary. I expect you to be reading this of what kinds of bad things could be in a property. If you don't put anything in this box, the buyers have 10 days to have the inspection. If the inspection is unsatisfactory to the buyer can accept the property or just terminate this contract. So this is really, really important. You're selling a house to somebody and they're like, well, I'm not sure about all this work. Well, you have the right to terminate this contract if you're not happy with what an expert says about the condition of the property. It's right here in writing. And then, or you could do the third thing, which is present a report potentially with written corrective proposals to the seller. and the seller within a certain time period will get back to you to try to solve the problem. It's important to try to get all this done. I like to think of it as 10 days to have an inspection and negotiate it. Otherwise, you're tearing this all apart to see how many days you have to respond back and forth. And my experience is that when you drag a buyer through this process, and a seller too, if you had to do 10 days plus 5 days plus 2 days plus 2 days, you've lost the emotional attachment to the property and you can lose the sale. So just common sense, try to get everything done within 10 days. Get a home inspector out there quickly, get a report to the seller the next day, try to negotiate it, strike while the iron is hot, as they say. And then here it says, if buyer and sellers are not able to reach a mutually acceptable written agreement, but buyer does not terminate this agreement, then basically the buyer has bought the house with its faults included. So it's important to watch the dates as well. When you sell a house, go onto your calendar and put the 10th day as your goal for having this all worked out, and then watch the days very carefully after that. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where due to your negligence the buyer has bought the property because you haven't watched how many days you have to get back to the seller to terminate the contract. Every once in a while you've got to extend the home inspection. Maybe the radon results come back late due to weather. Maybe the mold has to go out to a separate lab to determine what type of mold it is. Additional things like that. And then there's opportunities in these additional forms, not this one, where you can have a reply to seller, for example, and then ask to extend the radon or the mold inspection. And if the seller agrees, great. If they don't, the buyer can terminate the contract. Okay, real estate taxes and assessed value in Pennsylvania. This is just a notice that tax assessments can change at any time. In Philadelphia, in certain areas, they're raising the taxes. Other areas, it could happen very rarely outside of the city of Philadelphia right now. But any county can announce that, hey, we're going to raise taxes. And this is kind of a notice to everybody that the tax assessments can change and taxes can go up or down depending on your house. But this is just a notice in here so nobody gets caught flat-footed if there's a change in the tax assessments on properties. Generally in Pennsylvania, when the property is sold, the same tax assessment continues to the new buyer. It doesn't go with the new price. So notices and assessments. So we have some other notices that could happen. The township could send something to the homeowner saying they're going to widen the street and take some of their front lawn through eminent domain. Notices that come from the township that say, hey, we had your UNO inspection and you didn't get a licensed contractor when you did this work, therefore we're going to pursue you for that. Any type of notices that come along here have to be shown to the buyer, and then the buyer, if the seller doesn't do exactly what's required by law, it's going to go to the buyer where the buyer can terminate this contract. So notices are something very careful that you have to watch. If anything comes out from a condo association, notices as well, then you've got to watch that as well. And it goes on and on, shows you how it goes back and forth like a ping pong ball, with everyone agreeing to whatever the changes are that are stated in the notices. And at the end, the buyer can terminate the contract if they're not happy with what's going on. Number 16, if this property is a condominium or a homeowners association, you know that because it'll be right in the Trend MLS system. If it's a condominium, you're going to check here. If it's a homeowners association, you're going to check here. If it's a condominium, just remember that from the time after the property is sold and then from the time that the buyer receives the complete set of condominium documents that they're supposed to get by law, the buyer has 5 days from that point to change their mind for any reason. It's a good thing to remember. On the homeowners associations, they don't have that right of rescission, but if there is something onerous in there, for example, somebody suing a homeowners association, or maybe a homeowners association in default are not able to collect their monies, a mortgage company may terminate the contract on behalf of the buyer to protect their own interests. So the condominium, the law that governs it and the documents we look for is something called a 3407, and in a homeowners association it's 5407. We're just basically what I was talking about here. Someone's going to order a resale certificate in a condominium, which is the resale certificate is going to tell the title company and the buyer the true state of the union with the condominium. Is anybody suing anybody? Is the condominium financially healthy? Is there any special assessments that the buyer needs to be aware of? And of course the buyer would like to tie that together, get that quickly along with the homeowners association. If there's anything really difficult in there, they may opt to try to get out of the contract. Here we go right here. If the seller doesn't give these documents to the people quickly, the buyer can declare this agreement void. Basically, we're going to tell the buyer everything they need to know about a condo or homeowners association, everything that's possible to know. All right, number 17, title surveys and costs. So the property is going to have good and marketable title that is insurable by a reputable title company. So let's just say if someone buys a house, we get the title report back and the seller can't clear title, or there's a problem with the title that just won't be able to be figured out in order for the buyer to buy the house. The buyer will be reimbursed for the cost of title insurance, mechanics lien insurance, anything that the buyer put out, mortgage applications prior to that point. If the seller can't give good title, the buyer should be reimbursed for all those different things. Here, oil, gas, and mineral rights. I told you some of this contract has to do with things in different parts of the state. This is one of them. We don't worry about these things generally, or coal in eastern Pennsylvania. This private free transfer addendum. There were a bunch of builders who were talking for a while about, hey, when someone buys in this development, we're going to get them for a $1,000 fee. And then when the seller sells and a new buyer buys their seller's house, we're going to get them for another $1,000 fee. And they were looking at it as a perpetual way to have money going into the builder forever. That law was basically not passed in Pennsylvania. You won't see very much of that happening in this part of Pennsylvania, but it was put in the contracts because it was going on in parts of Pennsylvania at a certain period of time. Okay, real important part of the contracts, number 18, maintenance and risk of loss. Seller will maintain the property, including but not limited to structures, ground fixtures, appliances, and personal property. So seller is going to maintain the entire property, specifically listed in this agreement in its present condition, normal wear and tear accepted. If anything, the house, the fixtures, the appliance, the personal property included in the contract is not working properly or is missing, the buyer can, boom, terminate the contract if he's not taken care of. So the seller can repair or replace the property before settlement, provide notice of the seller not to do it, and then at the end it's going to be the buyer can terminate this agreement. All deposit money is returned to the buyer. So really no one's really bought the house until they've actually gone to settlement and everything is still in the same condition that it was in on the day of when the buyers bought it and had their home inspection. Number 19 is a statement about home warranties. It's basically saying that a buyer may purchase a home warranty. Realtors in the past have given notice about home warranties to some clients, not to other clients, but here we're putting it into contract so every buyer knows you can get a home warranty if you want one. Keep the agents who don't push the home warranties out of trouble. Recording, you should not record this document in the recorder of deeds. It's not the type of document that should be recorded. An assignment, this agreement is binding on the parties, their heirs, personal representatives. Buyer will not transfer or assign this contract prior to settlement without the written consent of seller unless otherwise stated in this agreement. Assignment may result in additional transfer taxes. So the state might say, hey, you bought the property, and then you assigned it to somebody else. You may have to pay additional transfer taxes because it looks like two transfers, not one transfer. Governing law, venue, and personal jurisdiction. This basically says that the Pennsylvania laws is what's going to govern this transaction, where it's going to go. Then the FIRPTA, Foreign Investment in Real Estate Property Tax Credit. If someone buys a property from a different country, is not a legal citizen of the United States, FIRPTA will require that the title company have made notice that this person is not a citizen of the United States. They're going to ask, we don't have to tell them. And then in some cases, when they make money on the sale of a property, a certain percentage of it will be set aside until it's determined that there are no taxes due on that property, which the person may have been absconding with. Number 24, Megan's Law. Pennsylvania General Assembly has passed Megan's Law. It basically is public notice of certain convicted sex offenders. Buyers are simply encouraged to contact the police department, Pennsylvania, or state police for information related to possible sex offenders in the neighborhood. This all says that everything that a real estate agent says, all the representations we made, everything that we've been repeated or said to a buyer, don't sue us for it. Of course, it's kind of hard to enforce that, but it's going to say that the representations made by agents are not creating liability, not necessarily the case. If there is a default or termination of return of deposits, If the buyer terminates this agreement of sale, they're going to do it unilaterally, which means we send a document out to the seller and say, we're terminating the contract, we want our money back. And then there may or may not be an argument about who gets the money back. I'm going to just not read this, but kind of give you the quick summary of it. So if a buyer terminates a contract or a seller terminates a contract and there's dispute over who gets the money, if neither party goes into small claims court to try to get it settled, or neither party reaches a mutually agreeable agreement about where the money goes, then after 365 days, the listing agent can give that money back to the sellers without any additional notice to the buyer. That's a change in our law. And it gets a lot of brokers out of the middle of some really difficult arguments. But you can read all that. That's pretty much what all that says here. It's important here. Unless otherwise checked in paragraph 26G, which we're looking at right here, seller may elect to retain these sums paid by buyer, including deposit monies. So basically, this is a very important box. Simply always check 26G. Seller is limited to retaining sums paid by buyer, including deposit monies as liquidated damages. So let me put that in a different way. Only money that a buyer has put into a deposit account can be kept by the seller in the case the seller has the opportunity to keep the deposit because of a buyer's default. That's why buyers will put up the first $500 or $1,000 without too much worry, but they always want to make sure that all the ducks are lined up in a row. The inspection is done, everything is good before they put their second deposit into an escrow account. Because if there is something that happens to them, say there's things they can't control, they go into a divorce with their spouse and can't complete the purchase of the property, then they could lose their deposit money. And this, by checking this box, we're limiting it to just losing the deposit money. For example, a seller could say, hey, you guys had a divorce, you decided not to buy my house, I'm taking your deposit money and I'm suing you. Well, if this box is checked, the "and I'm suing you" is wiped out. They don't have the right to sue people after that, at least unless it gets to court. And as I mentioned before, it could be all over the place in court. If there's any arguments based on this contract about who performed what, where the money goes, all that kind of stuff, this mediation clause is going to go into effect. There's mediation available through the National Association, Local Association of Realtors. And that'll keep us out of court in the respect we want to have legal fees and lawyers involved in those fights. We'll try to work it out in mediation. This release here takes the real estate agents off the hook for anything we said or did when the contract is signed. It may or may not be enforceable a little bit later. And then number 29, you learned in real estate school that there is a real estate recovery fund. If your buyer gets money out of the real estate recovery fund for something that you did, and there's no other place for the buyer to get any money, then you basically are not a realtor anymore. You're not a real estate agent anymore until you can first pay all the money back to the fund, and second, get permission from the real estate commission, who may or may not let you become a realtor again. Whatever this agreement contains provision that allows communication, the communication is satisfied if the documents are delivered to the addresses that are on page 1. That's basically what that's saying. It's also going to go on to say that communication between agents. If for example, another realtor tells me something, they're going to assume that I told my client, and if I told another realtor something, I'm going to be able to assume that they told their client. So communication to the agent is the same as communication to the party involved. That's pretty much, we're getting near the tail end here. Just some cleaning up here. If there's any attachments on the contract, you would check the box and throw on, hey, this property is contingent on the sale and settlement of another property. And you would write in additional terms. Don't get too carried away here. You don't want to be practicing legal work. So when you start writing anything more than a sentence, you should be very cautious and ask yourself, are you acting like an attorney here before you go and do all that stuff? These notices are important. The buyer should notify these things. It's not part of the contract per se, but it gets you off the hook a little bit later on if there's a miscommunication that you did give them the consumer notice, you did give them an estimate of closing costs, you did give them a deposit money notice, and you did give them a lead-based radon and mold pamphlets. It's a good record to have there because buyers may choose to forget that later on if they discover that in their property. So the buyer signs it. It does not have to be witnessed. The date is helpful because that's maybe the execution date and the date that all these things are or the dates are taken from in the contract. Seller signs it, whichever the latest contract date is, that's the one that is the execution date. And that's it. That's the standard agreement of sale. Hope you found this helpful. I'll be glad to explain this much more in detail anytime you want. Many times in my career I've had to take it out and read it and see exactly what it says. It's just that kind of a document. You're not going to get it by going over it this one time. Other people are going to interpret it differently. This is kind of our Bible that we take a look at to understand a real estate transaction. We'll get into some of the other addendums moving forward. Thank you.